So I'm gonna start with a quote. The quote is from Santorio's commentary on Ars Medica, dated 1612. In what way shall a physician called by his patients ascertain the natural state if he has not seen them before? As far as I'm concerned, if I have no previous knowledge of the patient's condition, I'm led to understand how much the distance from the natural state and the dose of the remedy can be by using the four instruments I mentioned before. Along with Galen, however, I shall declare that it is impossible that the exact and specific quantity will be penetrated by the physician, and so rightly Galen states that if I knew that exact quantity of action, I would consider myself like what people say Asclepius was. This passage, which comes almost at the very end of a substantial 600-page folio commentary on Galen's Ars Medica, 1612, is short, but historically invaluable, as it sheds light on the very use and application of precision instruments at the beginning of early modern medical practice. Its author is the Venetian physician Santorio Santori, whom most considered a genius. Indeed, by 1612, Santorio had already invented many instruments, altogether approximately 30, designed for mathematical, clinical, and surgical purposes. Those on which his fame nowadays rests, however, fall in the first category only, being devoted to the quantification of life processes. As stated in the quote above, there were four: the styliar chair, also called sella Santori, various types of pulsimeters, called pulsilogia Santori, various types of thermometers, hydrolabia Santori, and finally, hygrometers. Together, they were meant to measure the variations occurring within the body in response to external or internal changes. Depending on the intensity of such variations, the body reacted more or less severely. But geniality is often accompanied by scorn and envy. As pupils' letters show, in fact, Santorio was regarded as a kind of weirdo by his colleagues in Padua because of his inventions and his many innovations in theoretical and practical matters. A celibate man by choice, yet not by inclination, as his self-experiments on the beneficial effects of coitus on the insensible perspiration show profusely, Santorio had become a celebrity in the turn of few years when his book of aphorisms, titled Ars de Statica Medicina, published in Venice in 1614, caused a sensation across medical faculties in Europe, demonstrating that medicine could become a scientific discipline. A powerful and wealthy man, Santorio enjoyed the continued support of first-rate intellectuals like Paolo Sarpi, as well as patrons and protectors of the Venetian nobility, such as the Doge Niccolò Contarini and the Senator Andrea Rossini. So important and influential were these links that Santorio's critics had to voice their criticisms quietly and discreetly, unless they were, as the Obizzi controversy just mentioned by Jonathan proves, academic outsiders too eager to climb the social ladder. Be this as it may, resentment was somewhat justified, in that, thanks to his many inventions, Santorio had in effect put traditional medicine on a new basis. Physicians no longer needed to ground their analysis of the bodily functions on an equilibrium of humors and temperaments, but could turn to statics to draw exact indications about the conditions of their patients. In short, Medicina Statica opened up the possibility to turn medicine into a branch of mathematics. As stated in the above-mentioned quote, in fact, Santorio was the first one to use instruments such as thermometers, pulsimeters, hygrometers, and the styliar chair to ascertain the conditions of those patients whom he had no opportunity to meet before. measuring the pulse, the temperature of the body, the humidity of the air, and then weighing the body routinely was considered essential by him in order to get an indication of the present state of the patient's health. Now and again, Santorio insists that this present state, status adventitius, must be evaluated over a long period of time to get closer to a correct estimate of what the range of health and diseases are. As I shall explain later, in fact, he conceived disease as a distance from the state of equilibrium, so that the length of this distance could be measured in degrees. Measuring these degrees helped to get an estimate of the patient's individual health, for the use of the instruments revealed that, while individual conditions vary, they always do so within a range, latitudo, that is approximately the same for everyone. For instance, admitting that Santorio's thermometer had a resolution of 10 degrees, and that degree 6 is the temperature proper to the majority of healthy persons, a temperature of 3 or 9 in a patient could shed light on the severity of this condition, on the severity of his condition, and then allow the physician to intervene with the proper quantity of drugs or diaphoretics, while nonetheless lacking any prior knowledge of the patient's conditions. Such an approach, of course, could only be applied by knowing beforehand the range, or better, the segment length, proper to a healthy person, and therefore the range of degrees associated with it, which required lengthy experimental trials. As stated in a letter to Galileo, dated 9 February 1615, the sample of his experimental trials comprehended approximately 10,000 people over a period of 25 years, a figure that, as shown by Michael Stolberg in the previous lecture of this series, was quite normal for a Renaissance physician to cope with. It is therefore clear that Santorio used his instruments for diagnostic purposes. This is also what he explicitly states in the preface of his commentary on Avicenna's Canon, 1625, wherein he describes his instruments as diagnostic tools which complement and are therefore an indispensable addition to the Hippocratic Galenic medical rationale. My use of the verb complement here is not haphazardly chosen. Santorio highlights several times in his works that pulsimeters, thermometers, hygrometers, and scales can only provide a quantitative estimate of the patient's health, which, while infinitely more precise than anyone could gather by interpreting the symptoms of a given syndrome, cannot be entirely precise and pinpoint an exact and invariable quantity, illud quantum morborum. This aspect introduces us to the intellectual background of Santorio's devices, which were conceived to grant certainty to medical practice by restricting the margin of error inevitably associated to medicine, given its conjectural nature as an art. Start of the quote. Medical art is conjectural because of the quantity of the diseases, of the remedies, and the faculties, because of idiosyncrasies or properties of nature, as well as because of the individuating conditions. With respect to the quantity, Galen says indeed that to administer a remedy, it is necessary to know not only the species, but also the quantity of the disease, quantitas morbi, which, according to Galen, is a certain measure of the distance from the natural state and can be determined only by conjecture. We have for a long time thought of how to measure this quantity, even though this is possible sometimes and only in given conditions. And we have invented 4 instruments. End of quote. And yet this assertion tells us only half of the story. Here and there, Santorio adds some essential information as to what these instruments allow to achieve and why achieving it is so important. For instance, he repeatedly clarifies that they make it possible to look at aspects of a phenomenon that are not accessible through first-hand experience. By doing so, they in turn make it possible to extend the physician's perception, making visible and sensible phenomena that are otherwise invisible and insensible. In this sense, it is safe to state that while independent of the latter's research, Santorio is pursuing the same aim as his colleague Galileo with the telescope. They both want to magnify a phenomenon to look deeper into it. On the other hand, the fact that one was looking at the macrocosm while the other at the microcosm can be seen as an embodiment of the Renaissance cosmos with its all-pervasive analogical consonances and actions at a distance, whereby quod est inferius est sicut id, quod est superius, as above, so below. Terms such as sensibilis and insensibilis are thus recurrent in Santorio's descriptions of his instruments, justifying sufficiently that he aimed to extend human perception beyond its natural boundaries. On Santorio's weighing chair, the insensible perspiration becomes sensible by using a scale. The imperceptible degrees of temperature and humidity of the air become perceptible with thermometers and hygrometers. Smallest variations in the frequency of the pulse are magnified using pulsilogy. The obscure process of the generation of colors becomes apparent by designing advanced optical experiences and new instruments to perform them. Fine-tuned observations are only one of the benefits which medical practice gains from the invention of the new devices. The other is the possibility of rigorous prognosis. Regarded as the true kernel of Hippocratic medicine, precise prognosis, namely the capacity to predict the outcome of a disease, was often avoided by physicians, who willingly accommodated a patient's self-perception as to the severity of their own disease in order for their reputation not to be affected by failure. Quite aside from professional concerns, however, the reasons to avoid precision in prognosis were both practical and theoretical in kind. As Galen specifies in his Ars Medica, and the context in this case is essential, as we shall note, the symptoms that accompany a change of status in the patient's condition, say from the healthy to the neutral state, can only be perceived when it causes a sensible impairment in the normal bodily function, ex officiorum manifesta lesione, which meant that the Galenic physician could only intervene on the patient once the disease had already started making its course, progressively, and therefore also insensibly to the body. Hence, being able to track insensible changes causing the onset of a disease amounted to being able to prevent it. Time and again, Santorio proudly stresses this possibility as one of the main advantages of his inventions, especially doing so in the case of the pulsilogium. In a famous aphorism of his medical statics, section 1, aphorism 42, he states emphatically that early seeds of diseases, prima morborum semina, are more safely tutior known by tracking the alteration in the normal quantity of insensible perspiration than by looking at the impairment of normal bodily function, ex lesis officiis. It is noteworthy to bear in mind that an instrument like Santorio's chair makes visible the smallest variations in such a quantity by measuring the variations of weight to which the body is subject before and after each meal. In this sense, the quantitative measurement of the perspiratio insensibilis, the insensible perspiration, is intended by Santorio less as a matter of investigation per se, than as an indication of the present and future conditions of the body, with more minute calculations meant to sketch a reliable trend in the patient's health. By calculating the quantity of perspiration, the doctor could measure the quantity of drugs to be administered at any given stage of the disease progression, while ascertaining the magnitude of it, the magnitudo morbi. A normal release of insensible perspiration indicated an organism whose functions were in perfect condition, for a normal organism is the one capable of keeping the same temperature, weight, and pulse frequency constant despite changes in the environment. In short, a normal organism is one that has the capacity to resist, the potentia resistendi, these alterations. From what has been shown thus far, it seems clear that in inventing these instruments, Santorio was addressing three strictly related needs of medical practice. The first is limiting as far as possible the contingency in cure. The second is to magnify a phenomenon to better investigate it. The third is preventing diseases by tracking minimal changes in the body's health. These three needs can only be achieved by underpinning medical diagnosis with the use of mathematics. In this sense, at least, Santorio was right in calling his statistical trials medical mathematics, mathematic medic. And yet, despite their importance, the solution to these problems only provides us with the general backbone of Santorio's quantitative program. To delve deeper into it, we must address another series of questions. First and foremost, what these instruments were meant to measure, how they worked, and then how Santorio performed his experimentations, and last but not least, on what kind of patients. As for the kind of phenomenon they were meant to ascertain, Santorio is rather explicit. This was the magnitudo morbi, the magnitude of disease, namely the severity of an illness, which in Galenic medicine is expressed as a distance from the region of health. Start of the quote. Galen teaches us how we can measure the quantity and the strength of hot and cold in intemperate mixture. He states the quantity or the strength of the intemperate mixture will be as much as the distance from the natural state, quantus est recessus a statu naturale. I make use of four instruments by means of which I ascertain the quantity of this distance. The first one is an instrument I invented and is called the pulsillogium, through which we grasp how much in each day each individual departs from his best condition. The same result is provided by the second instrument, by means of which, by putting in movement a leaden ball attached to a suspended thread, and from its movement on the thread, and from the greater or smaller lengthening, anyone will be able to observe the natural motion of the pulse and its distance from the natural condition, recessum a naturale. By means of the pulsillogium, I measure with great diligence the motion and rest of the artery, and I can also compare this measure with the pulse of the previous days. With the third instrument, I measure, by means of statistical experiments, the various distances, varios recessus, with respect to the natural state. It is not useful to give here further information on the secrets of statics, as in short time I will publish 400 aphorisms on statistical experiments. He's famously referring to his Medicina Statica. The fourth instrument, which is wonderfully advantageous, is a sort of glass ampulla with which we can measure not only the temperament of the air, but also of any part of the body. How is for every day the distance from the natural state? End of quote. It is a long quote, to be sure, but it provides essential information as to what Santorio is actually measuring. As noted above, these instruments require the physician to preliminarily define the range of health, which could be measured only by instruments able to provide a comparative indication of the variations in this state. As an example, an instrument like the pulsillogium, by virtue of the isochronism of the pendulum's wings, provides a constant and reliable parameter to detect and therefore track and measure any minimal variation in the healthy condition of the pulse. As such, measurement takes place by comparison. First by measuring the vital functions of a healthy patient for a long period of time, and then by monitoring the effects induced in the body by alterations in habits such as exercise and rest, digestion, sleep, sexual intercourse, and so forth. As said, the same approach obtains to scales, thermometers, and hygrometers. The preliminary assessment of the patient, that is to say whether sick or healthy, is conducted according to the Galenic definition of health, which, as seen, is based on the normal functions of the body not being impaired. A definition that is sufficiently broad to be tailored to the needs of a variety of individuals. Linking back to a century-old tradition that stretches back to the 14th century and to the commentaries on Galen's Ars Medica by Turisanus, Gentile da Foligno, and Jacopo da Forlì, but it had progressively weakened during the Renaissance. Santorio identifies health not just as the equilibrium of fluids and temperaments, but as the capacity by the body to actively resist morbid causes, potentia resistendi egretudinis causis, and therefore to persevere in the same state, potentia perdurante. In this sense, the severity of the disease is nothing but the expression of the intensity with which the body resists the onset of morbid causes. It can thus be conceptualized as a force acting in a certain time through a certain material medium and accordingly specialized as a segment in the midst of which lies the region of health, with the extremes of the segment intersecting the extreme conditions of the body, that is to say, too fast, too slow pulse, too high, too low a temperature, too fat or too thin a body. In keeping with this approach, the diseases can now be visualized as a distance of greater or shorter entity, lapsus minimus, lapsus maximus, from the state of health, and thus measured by subdividing the length obtained into many degrees. The consequences of this way of approaching health and disease are momentous and transcend the field of medicine alone. With Santorio, the emphasis lies no longer on defining what a disease is, but on how it affects the body and how these effects can be measured. This alone will be enough to consider Santorio and the medical field being revolutionized amongst the main actors within the 17th century new scientific developments. And yet, there is more. The invention of thermometers, scales, pulsilogia, and hygrometers presupposes a new theory of qualities that, for Santorio, are essentially geometrical, being placed, shaped, and numbered, situs, figura, numerus. Such an assumption led Santorio to develop a form of corpuscularianism that preceded Galileo's similar theories by at least 20 years. In fact, the possibility of obtaining a homogeneous indication between the measurement of a vital force, such as the potentia resistendi, and the new precision devices is grounded on a new theory of matter, which is considered of a granular texture and can accordingly be quantified, therefore allowing for Santorio's fine-tuned experimentation. In light of what it has been discussed thus far, the audience might be tempted to ask why such a detailed historical reconstruction of the use and applications of these instruments has not resulted, thus far at least, in reliable modern replicas. Several reasons contributed to that. The first is lack of information. Santorio's contributions have been almost entirely forgotten, and from the 18th century onwards, scholars have progressively lost interest in his work. The second reason is contingent. For Santorio had promised to publish the engravings of his new instruments in a special work called De Instrumentis Medicis non amplius visis, medical instruments no longer seen, which, he informs us, he had started sketching as early as 1603. While Santorio makes frequent references to this book in his extant works, the book in question has often been considered lost or never written. The engravings and descriptions he provided in the 1625 edition of his commentary on Avicenna's canon, which I showed at the beginning, are rough, and Santorio only provides a summary description of how they worked and what they were actually meant to measure. It was done out of fear that his invention could be claimed by others, as Galileo had done before with Santorio's pulsilogium and thermometer. On the other hand, that the instruments themselves existed and were actually used in medicine is testified by historical records. For instance, in 1633, the Bohemian musician, physician, and philosopher Johann Caspar Horn donated an hydrolabium santori, that is to say a thermometer, to the Nazio Germanica at the University of Padua for medical use, a gift which provides further evidence that these instruments were in high demand. I would like to conclude this talk with a coup de théâtre. For it took me 7 years of extensive research, but I think I'm now able to show the veracity of Santorio's claims and the existence of the book he meant to publish. The proof of his existence comes from a text published in 1620 by an Italian pupil of Santorio, wherein a few engravings are the same as those used by Santorio in the later editions of his commentary on Avicenna's canon, and especially that, which is very rare and kept only in Padua, as far as I'm concerned, of 1626. Affected by Leonardo's syndrome, that is a tendency to hide essential information of a discovery out of fear of being copied, Santorio asked the engraver to remove from the picture any note that could help someone to understand the use of the instrument, a thermometer adopted to measure environmental air. The result was rather clumsy. Indeed, the Italian words d'inverno, in winter, and d'estate, in summer, displayed in the 1620 source as corresponding rightly to the levels of water within the thermometer, have been erased, but only in part, leaving out the final O and E. The 1620 source does acknowledge Santorio's medical statics at least once, in the form of a short marginal note, but then goes on discussing Santorio's instruments in detail without ever again mentioning his name. Crucially, however, the source contains entire passages that echo or exactly translate into Italian sentences used by Santorio in his earlier and later works, and which we know from epistolary exchanges he had not started working on at that date. I'm currently writing an article on these new discoveries, but I can anticipate that the text provides a fundamental information as to what the instruments measure, their dimensions, use, and experimental sample. For instance, we gather that Santorio's patients were predominantly nobles because their perfect health was indispensable to the safe functioning of the Venetian Republic. Santorio himself will later hint at this aspect of his research when, in 1625, he will highlight the necessity to hide or embellish his instruments, most notably the bulky chair and the thermometer, because of the presence of nobles, procerers, and because anything new is seen as strange and derided by those who are not familiar with it. Another important aspect that emerges from my discovery is the practical application these instruments allowed, especially thermometers, to measure the temperature of the air. These indications were used to warm up or cool down a room so that the patient's body was prevented from exposure to extreme environmental alterations. The stellar chair served a similar purpose in that it helped to establish how much food and drugs should be taken as a consequence of the organism receding from its normal parameters. And the source specifies that for people who find weighing themselves strange or awkward, alternative practices are available. In conclusion, this new testimony provides us with first-hand evidence that the invention of the new instruments was used not just in natural philosophy, but to concretely intervene in the patient's health and to quantify therapy. With this last remark, we can finally come back to the main question of this talk, namely what the relevance of Santorio's medical contributions to the development of early modern science actually was. Measurement and quantification have always, and rightly, been considered instrumental to establish the character of an experimental science. Yet, for a long time, medicine has been excluded from the consideration it deserves in shaping the emergence of experimental philosophy, as its contributions were seen as derivative from those of physics and astronomy. Until very recently, Santorio's very inventions were regarded as embodiments, if not copies, of those Galileo had invented. Yet, historical evidence shows that this is not true, and it is time to revise the narrative, for it was Santorio who inspired Galileo and was the one who advanced innovative theories, experiments, and instruments that were later considered by Galileo's admirers as many embodiments of his genius. In this sense, re-establishing Santorio at the center of the intellectual and cultural transformations that shaped science at the beginning of the 17th century means also vindicating the role that medicine played in that transformation. First, by conceptualizing health and diseases in terms of magnitude and force, and then by prompting new directions to the study, to study them quantitatively. It was a matter of innovation and change within continuity, rather than a radical break altogether. Santorio's chief merit lies in redefining the medical concept of equilibrium as a standard problem of statics, namely as an equilibrium between forces. To analyze these forces, he invented instruments able to monitor all the parameters associated with equilibrium, from bodily and environmental temperature to pulse and humidity of the air, including air's gravity as exerted on the body in different seasons and weather conditions. He thought rightly that the body had the capacity of dynamically restore its healthy parameters, and for this very reason, Santorio's investigation laid a foundation not just for the study of metabolism, but for the much more important one of homeostasis. Thank you.